Hello and a warm welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining this Hardman Co Investor Forum. My name is Keith Hiscock and I'm the Chief Executive of Hardman Co. These forums give investors the chance to hear a company's investment case and then question the management. The next company to present is Shield, which is a commercial stage pharmaceutical company with a focus on the iron deficiency space. Lead product is called Ferrocru. This one's AIM listed with a market cap of just under £90 million. And today we're very lucky to have Greg, the CEO of the business, present to us. Greg, over to you.
Thank you again for the invitation to the conference. To Tim and Simon, very interesting presentation there. And I was thinking about as you're in discussions, we as Shield are at the very opposite end. I'm going to talk a lot today about the excitement around commercialization and drug launches and where we are. So I'm excited to be here. So let me see if I can. So I'm the CEO here. I joined Shield Therapeutics just 3 months ago. So June 1 was my start date here, and obviously jumped on board at a very exciting time, and happy to present our company to all of you today. As noted earlier, we are a company focused on the treatment of iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia, a very, very prevalent condition out there afflicting literally millions of patients worldwide. We are a London AIM-listed company, as you see listed here, and our primary focus is we are a commercial stage company. So Acrifer is our product, or ferric maltol as it's known in the US. Ferrocru is primarily what it's known as outside the US. And again, this is a novel oral iron treatment for treating iron deficiency in adults. But asked, coming into the presentation, they asked us to kind of condense our deck down to fit into about a 15-minute presentation. So for that reason, I'm going to concentrate almost all of my efforts today on the U.S. As you see noted here, back in the earlier spring, in March of earlier this year, the company went ahead and raised just under $40 million US in order to get the launch started in the U.S. here. We officially commenced that launch with having product available in the wholesaler channel in the US in the third quarter. And as you see listed here, we've out-licensed the product to Norgine in Europe, where it is approved by the EMA and commercial available right now, primarily in the German and UK markets, among a few others. We did a deal back in the early part of 2020 with ASK Pharma for China. So we are in the development process there to get that towards approval. And then just last month, we announced a deal for the Republic of Korea with Korea Pharma starting, and so we're going to start that development work as we speak. So the product is out and available now in the US, as well as certain countries in Europe, and certainly progressing along the right development path outside of those two areas. Let me spend a little bit of time talking to you about the market and the opportunity. And, as Martin alluded to in his opening comments, what gets me out of the bed in the morning is things like this, right? When I look at, a product, what the opportunity is, understanding what the strategy is, how we might fit into what is out there in treatment, and just the excitement about an overall launch. And so in a nutshell, all this gets me out of bed in the morning and jumping away to get at my desk. So iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia, these are very, very prevalent conditions that cut across a lot of different disease states or underlying reasons that cause both the iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia. So you can see listed here, you got ranges of percentages for both iron deficiency, which is, really to distinguish the two. Iron deficiency is low iron stores, normally measured by ferritin levels in the body. And then iron deficiency anemia is where not only the iron store is low, but your hemoglobin gets to a threshold where you really start to feel the effects of this disease. And I should say, I don't have it in this deck per se, but iron deficiency anemia, it is a very, very serious and complicated disease. I've heard some people make the comment that if you're anemic slightly, you're a little tired or fatigued, and almost comparable to what the end of a long day or end of a long week might feel like. And that is not the case. That is dramatically underestimating, what this disease does to patients on an everyday basis. This is extreme fatigue, mental confusion, physical issues where just common everyday tasks, whether it be preparing the evening meal, climbing a flight of stairs, doing the laundry, they become almost insurmountable, right? So this is an area where not only is it highly prevalent, the good news for us is that it is treated by physicians. So in other words, this is not an area that we need to convince physicians to treat. If they see patients with iron deficiency anemia, whether it be low ferritins or low hemoglobins, they will act to treat. The challenges you'll see coming forward here is that the treatment options today are simply lacking in a lot of different areas. There's a strong need for a new treatment such as Accrufer. But as I said, this cuts across a lot of different disease states overall. We have the luxury of our label being very broad, meaning that regardless of the etiology or underlying cause of the disease, we can treat it with our product of Accrufer. So our label is literally to treat iron deficiency in U.S. adult patients as well as in the EU as well. So on the treatment side, as I mentioned before, this is an area where if physicians see iron deficiency anemia, they will treat it. And really, right now, there's kind of two camps of treatment options that are available for physicians today. On the lower left-hand side, you'll see that very common is oral irons that are used. And these are primarily oral irons that are available over the counter in the US. These are ferrous-based irons, mostly ferrous salt-based irons overall, that literally you could walk down to any pharmacy and pick one up off the shelf and give it a try. So, they're convenient, they're readily available. The real challenge here is no matter if you talk to a patient, you talk to a clinician, or you talk to a loved one of a patient, the first words out of their mouth, generally speaking, are tolerability. You just can't tolerate it. A lot of GI adverse events, a lot of discontinuation rates as well, and just really not an efficient, absorption of the iron overall. So almost everybody will try these first universally, but a very, very high percentage of patients, do not continue with this therapy and don't get the treatment that they need. On the other end of the spectrum, depicted on the lower right-hand side here, is IV iron. Now, IV iron is very effective and as far as rapid iron repletion overall, good bioavailability. This is an area where you're literally infusing iron directly into the veins of the patient overall, so no surprise you're going to get a fast repletion of iron. The real challenge with IV irons is the infusion part. So you have to go to a hospital-based infusion center or a hematology clinic here in the US and sit through multiple infusions that take up multiple days in order to get the iron restored to the level you need it to be overall. So even pre-COVID, this is a real inconvenience factor where, if you're a working parent, you got to get time off of work, go to the infusion center, sit there for several hours and do this multiple times in order to get your iron stores back to where they need to be overall. You add, what we've all been dealing with the last, 20 months with COVID, quite frankly, the thought of patients going into an infusion center to get their iron, let's just say that's another, big barrier to kind of getting patients treated the way they should. So if you can think about these as, two ends of the spectrum, what you end up with is a lot of patients kind of sitting in the middle looking for a better oral iron treatment because they're not quite sick enough where they feel like they have to go to get an IV iron and take that time to go to the infusion center overall. So a very, very wide open space here for which to operate. Now in the US, the overall iron replacement market, which is made up of oral therapies and IV therapies, is extremely large, but you've got oral therapies making up almost 90% of that volume overall. So there are 10 million prescriptions per year for oral iron. So a very, very big market. And again, these are, OTCs, ferrous-based compounds, and generics of OTCs to try to get it covered for insurance overall. Down on the lower left-hand side, you see that, of this 10 million prescriptions per year, there's about 65,000 physicians that drive almost 2/3 of that oral iron volume. So that's your segment that you want to really think about here is those 65,000 physicians. And importantly, as shown on the graph on the right-hand side, this is primarily made up of primary care physicians and OBGYNs. Those are by far and away number one and number two. Following that, you've got a smattering of gastroenterologists and hematologists and a few other specialties, but primary care physicians and OBGYNs drive the overwhelming majority of that volume. There's a couple slides in here showing some market research that we did. And this was fielded in June of this year, so just before we made the product available and had our sales force go out and start calling on physicians. This was done with 102 physicians, all of which are very high prescribing oral iron physicians. So we kind of looked at those 65,000 physicians. You'll see that we are calling on about 4,000 of those. This 100-person market research was fielded mostly from that 4,000 physician target list. And it's made up of primarily primary care physicians, OBGYNs, and specialists. So the questions we asked them on the left-hand side to start with is, what is your current satisfaction level with currently available oral iron replacement therapies. And you can see here, regardless of the specialty, whether it be primary care, OBGYN, or specialist, which in this case is GI and hematology, it's a very low satisfaction level with currently available oral irons. So as I said before, I think everybody knows that they're available, they try them, but even physicians have a low satisfaction and really a low believability that they're actually going to work. But again, everybody tries those first. When you shift gears and ask them on the right-hand side, what is it that you would like to have from an attribute perspective in an iron replacement therapy? The obvious questions come up, or answers come up. Well-tolerated, effective, and I would add and certainly adhere to be affordable from an out-of-patient pocket cost to the patient overall. So they're not happy with what they have right now from oral replacement therapy. What they want is a better tolerated and effective therapy that they can give to their patients. So we believe we have that in Accrufer. So Accrufer is ferric maltol. Accrufer is the brand name in the US. And in this kind of relatively complicated graph describes what makes us different and unique versus what's available right now on the over-the-counter basis. And the way that I think about this and the way I like to describe this is simple, that ferrous-based compounds, which are primarily the over-the-counters, what happens when a patient takes those and swallows them, as soon as it gets into their stomach, the product dissociates. So the product has to dissociate, the iron has to dissociate from the salt in order to be absorbed. But as soon as that happens, you have free iron floating in the gut, which A, can irritate the gut, but B, creates reactive oxygen species and starts basically this whole cascade of events in your stomach, which leads to a lot of the adverse events you see. So again, when you look at OTCs, ask clinicians what the issues are, it's GI-related adverse events, tolerability, and a lot of discontinuation rates. So what makes ferric maltol different? So ferric maltol is ferric iron surrounded by a maltol coating. So we kind of shield it in that regard. What that allows it to do, it allows the ferric maltol, when taken by a patient, when they swallow it, it not only goes through the gut, but gets into the large intestine before it starts to dissociate. So basically the way to think about this is the iron gets delivered right to the point in the large intestine where it's going to be absorbed before it starts to break apart. So number one, you bypass that whole negative cascade that I described that takes place in the gut because that's not happening there. And number two, we're a relatively low dose iron. We only have 60 milligrams that's taken per day, so 30 milligrams twice a day. We're relatively low dose iron because again, the iron's getting to where it's going to be absorbed and has maximal absorption. So we believe, based on the clinical trials, which I'll showcase here in a minute, not only are you going to get the effectiveness you need to treat the iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia, but you do it in a way that is better tolerated and well tolerated by the patients. So we did a couple different trials. This is showcasing our study that we did for patients with inflammatory bowel disease. And if folks know people with either ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, this is typically a pretty difficult patient population to treat. These are quiescent patients overall. And it's a busy slide, but way to think about this is two different studies, right? So you first had the 12-week pivotal phase shown on the left-hand side of that graph. And then you had the long-term extension phase where we extended that 12 weeks out another 52 weeks overall. This was 128 patients, double-blind, placebo-controlled. Again, that primary 12-week phase was showcasing the effectiveness of Accrufer from an efficacy standpoint of can we raise hemoglobin levels up. And you see in the left-hand graph there that we are very, very effective at raising hemoglobin levels from a baseline of just over 11 to about 13 and a half overall during that 12-week pivotal period, highly statistically significant against placebo. We then took those same patients and kept them on Accrufer all the way for another 52 weeks. And you see that we're able to maintain that hemoglobin levels very, very effectively over during that time. Conversely, we took the placebo patients from that 12-week study, put them on Accrufer after that 12th week and watch them go through another 52 weeks. And again, you see a nice rise in hemoglobin levels overall during that 52-week extension period. So this showcases a couple things. Number one, you can get kind of rapid restoration of your iron stores and your hemoglobin levels shown here across the first 12 weeks. But then importantly, you can actually maintain those same hemoglobin and iron levels for a long period of time. So for patients that are chronically ill, as many of these patients are, this showcases very well the overall effectiveness, both in a short-term, but also a long-term maintenance type of therapy. I mentioned tolerability before, and this is our tolerability profile across our phase 3 studies. I should add that we also did a study in chronic kidney disease patients that was very similar in design to the IBD study I just showed you. Again, for brevity's presentation, I didn't put that graph in there, but very similar results as far as increasing hemoglobin levels, as well as showcasing a maintenance on the back end. So this tolerability profile is kind of the pooled data of both the IBD study as well as the CKD populations. You see on the right-hand side the graph, showcasing adverse events. And honestly, when you have a product, when you're doing a placebo-controlled study, when your product can be below 5%, from an adverse event perspective, it almost becomes comparable to placebo. So we're really, really happy with a lot of these results. Very important for us is on the lower left-hand side that the overall percentage of patients who discontinued treatment due to AEs was extremely low at 4.6%. So as I described before, how Accrufer works, why it's different than ferrous-based compounds overall, we think our clinical data showcases a very strong effort here that we have something that physicians are looking for, an oral iron therapy that is effective but also well tolerated by the patients. So I mentioned where we kind of position this is in between these oral OTCs as well as IV iron. So going to the U.S. launch, we made product available in the U.S. July 1st, and that is the point that our sales reps, they were hired during the second quarter. They started to begin to set up appointments with physicians in the U.S. as of July 1st. So I think as we look at this market research going into the launch, a couple things to point out here. On the top is the question that we asked around awareness. So how many physicians were aware of Accrufer prior to us launching overall? And you can see from an unaided perspective, I'd say that answer was 0. In fact, I think there was one physician out of 102 that had heard of Accrufer going in. Now, this is certainly a challenge that we are taking active steps to kind of work on, which I'll describe here for all of you. However, I'm not surprised by this. This was not a shock. So the company pivoted rather quickly. There wasn't a lot of market development work, not a lot of pent-up demand about Accrufer. So really, we need to get out there and drive awareness. The way that we're doing it for the first couple months is primarily through our 30-person sales force, getting in front of physicians. We've got our website up and running, but as you'll see soon that we've got a broader media plan and awareness driving plan that's just kicking off here during this quarter. On the good news front, on the lower left-hand side, when physicians were shown a profile of Accrufer, they had a very, very positive reaction. Very positive reaction, strong interest in learning more. And in the lower right-hand side, you see that where they positioned Accrufer vis-a-vis what they currently use today, it is very consistent with the way that we think about where they use it, which is right after OTC failures, and certainly before they go to an IV iron perspective. So for us, as we get out there and launch, I think as I look at this, for the first 6 to 9 months, this is really what we need to do, right? Number one, how do we redefine the expectations of an oral iron therapy? We all saw that when they think of oral irons, they don't have a high confidence in them. We need to change that mindset. We're going to do that with Accrufer. Number 2 is driving awareness. Number 3 is building up our advocates. Number 4 is making it easy for patients to start and stay on therapy. And you see down the lower text here, drive awareness is critical. Generating clinical experience for patients and physicians, and then certainly establishing our payer coverage. On the payer coverage side, we are very focused right now in the U.S. on commercial payers and pharmacy benefit managers, which drive most of that commercial landscape. We are contracting with them to get added to formulary, and our positioning is consistent with what we've talked about before, which is after failure of an OTC, so kind of a second line positioning from a formulary perspective. Now, important that it takes time to get on formulary. There's generally about 6 steps that have to take place where, setting an appointment to do a clinical presentation, setting an appointment to do a business discussion, having negotiations about the business discussion, getting a contract put in place, and then negotiating the contract. And then finally is the start date of that. So, all of that takes time. It can take up to 12 months in order to get yourself on formulary, and every payer kind of works at different timelines, but generally speaking, it can be, a relatively long process. So important for us, while we're building up our payer coverage, is making sure that the physicians that we get in front of that want to write Accrufer for their patients, they can do so and the patient can get that. And the way that we do that is with our reimbursement hub, where physician writes a prescription, goes into our reimbursement hub. We determine quickly if the patient has insurance. If it does, that prescription is filled under the insurance. If they don't, we'll turn around and sell that directly to the patient for a nominal cost. And then we'll repeat that process every month to check, is the patient's insurance covering it now? So as our payer coverage builds over time, these patients will move from nominally cost patients that we're selling to directly into paying patients under the insurance side. But importantly, it gets the patient on the drug and gets the physician some access and experience here as well. So our overall launch strategy, you can see here depicted by the triangle, this is that 65,000 physicians I mentioned before that are driving almost 2/3 of the oral iron prescriptions. We are calling on the top 4,000 today with a field force of 30 representatives. That's about the coverage we can hit, is those 4,000 physicians. Anecdotally, the feedback, when we can get in front of a physician, when it's not a COVID-related issue, when we can get in front of a physician, they are very receptive to the message, a lot of interest, so very consistent with what we've seen on the market research side. I noted that our payer meetings and discussions were ongoing. On the left-hand side, you'll see from an awareness perspective, a lot of our digital and media placements targeted to drive that awareness launched earlier this month and are still launching. So throughout this quarter, we continue to get out there to figure out how do we drive awareness amongst this broader physician set overall. And then lastly, we think about, how do we get broader access to these, other physicians there? There's a lot of different tactical ways that we can do that will run in concert with our payer coverage coming online as well.
Greg, thanks very much. There's a lot of questions. So I think given the time, I'm going to try and clump them together. The first one, we've got one from Joe about slow European sales growth. But I think actually it links very much to other questions from James and Mo, which essentially is what can be done to improve the performance of Norgine in Europe, whilst accepting there is some disruption from COVID, the performance of Norgine appears tepid. Do you have very much influence over how this can be boosted?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I apologize, I didn't put too much on the European side just for conciseness of the presentation. But look, I've had several discussions with the Norgine team since my arrival here. And, obviously without disclosing, a lot of details on those discussions, what I found from a team is a couple of things. One is they're very motivated and very excited about Ferrocru, as it's known there in Europe overall. I was able to spend some time specifically with the German team. And, I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing underneath, right? I think they have the right strategy, the right mindset overall. COVID definitely kind of had an impact, on things, but it's notable that we saw our half-year results. They had a 51% increase in the overall packs sold in the first half of 2021 versus the back half of 2020. That's a very encouraging sign. As I kind of peeled away underneath that, I'm encouraged by some of the things that they're doing from a tactical perspective. Physicians are calling on, underlying results. So, by no means is that a promise, but I do believe they're very much on the right track. In addition to that, what we worked on is, we really need to get the reimbursement accelerated, if at all possible, in the other countries, right? So Germany is great. There's some things we need to work on from the UK in order to drive, better uptake there. But then certainly thinking about, Spain, Italy, France, how do we accelerate that reimbursement process? So more to follow there, but my initial interactions with them have been encouraging, but obviously I'm watching it very closely.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot of questions on the US, as you can imagine, but I'll try and sort of clump a few of them together. In terms of what one relates to, is the size of your sales force sufficient to penetrate and educate the US market? So those 4,000 key prescribers you were targeting, and related to that, how many of the target physicians have been reached out to date, since the launch in June, and maybe in answering those, you might want to follow that with what's the biggest disappointment so far following the US launch?
So the first question is the 4,000, is our sales force sufficient to cover that? And my short answer is it's sufficient to cover the 4,000, but certainly as you saw, there's a lot of physicians that are out there that write prescriptions that we're not reaching today. So now there's different ways to reach them, right? And this is part of what the work the team and I have been doing here, right? So from a broad-based perspective to drive awareness, right? We launched our, media plan, kind of other, digital tactics overall to drive broader awareness of Aquifer, and that can reach a lot more physicians, obviously, than a direct personal rep overall, right? So, number one is like, how do we start to drive that awareness? Number two is our 30 reps working really hard to get in front of those 4,000 physicians they're targeting, and make them aware of Aquifer, generate prescriptions, get the clinical experience. I think we've done, I'd say, a decent job of getting in front of physicians overall, like everywhere else. Not to use this as an excuse, but COVID has certainly kind of, been back and forth with the Delta variant. You get different pockets in the U.S. that are accessible, not accessible. So, it's not like a normal launch where you just have unfettered access, across the board. So, I think we've been doing a decent job. I'm not going to give any metrics today, but the team is working really hard to get in front of those physicians overall. The question becomes then, how do we start to reach some of those other physicians, right? So, assuming we get the payer coverage that I expect we'll get over time, how do we generate prescriptions and the targets we're calling on now, but how do we reach those others? And there's a multitude of ways you can do that through either, direct personal promotion by expanding your team, indirect personal promotion. There's lots of different options that we are exploring right now in order to really maximize the effectiveness of that overall. Is there a disappointment in the launch? No, I would definitely not classify anything I've seen thus far as a disappointment. I would just point out that the biggest challenge, that we had to overcome, and I've talked about this a little bit, in addition to getting your payers to cover your product, which is critical, it's that low awareness, right? It would have been optimal to have, maybe a 12 months of kind of awareness driving, get some KOLs on board. We didn't have that luxury, right? So drive the awareness now. For the first couple months, it's been, to use the terminology, it's been hand-to-hand combat, right? It's literally relying on our 30 reps to get in front of a doctor to make them aware of the product and then make them aware of it over and over again. So, that's not the most efficient way to do it, but we're getting to where we need to be.
Is there a risk that the company has become an attractive takeover target given its low valuation? So I suppose what he's really asking is what sort of defense strategy you've got if something like that were to happen.
Look, I'll be honest, my focus right now is really just, building the right business here for the long term, right? And, I don't look at the stock price on a day-to-day basis. I've got, 1,000 other things that we're trying to do here, but we want to make sure we're building a good, solid business. So, executing really well in the US, as the earlier question, accelerating, adoption here in Europe as well. We take care of what we can do and we can control. I can't really spend a lot of time worrying if someone's going to come in and, want to buy us and what that might look like or react to it when it gets there, obviously. But, for me, it's all right, how do we build a very strong but very successful business, and we'll let everything else kind of play itself out.
And I think just a quick one from John. He just inquires, what price are you selling it at in the United States and how does it compare with Europe?
So that's a really complicated question and probably not a good one to try to draw comparables to, because the market's so different. Every country in Europe is different than the US, so it's probably not worthwhile to spend a lot of time at. Our wholesale acquisition price in the US is $500 per month overall, and then whatever discounts, rebates we need to give to payers to get on formularies, all that eventually would be rolled up in our gross to net. But trying to compare prices across the myriad of different areas, it's a bit of a challenge to do.
Greg, thank you very much.